Welcome to Magic Boy Productions, where we build and play decks each week with a focus on improving as deck builders and players. This week we'll be getting weird with Ivy, Gleeful, Spellthief in bracket 3 with an Aura midrange list. We'll start off with the deck tech where we talk about the game plan and the cards included, then head into 2 narrated games to see Ivy in action with game reviews for key takeaways. After that, we'll explore some final thoughts on the deck based on what we learned. The suggestion to build around Ivy came from a comment on a previous video, and since my process for picking commanders is pretty vibes-based and scattershot, I like the idea of working on a legend I probably wouldn't have considered myself. I probably won't be able to do it for every comment, but feel free to drop suggestions for future commanders and any restrictions or variants you might want to see in the final list. This is a pretty straightforward Ivy deck overall. We exploit her ability to create token copies of auras that target other creatures, and the auras and targets alike provide value. Making extra copies of Ivy multiplies the yields, and then later in the game we look to copy much bigger auras. This is a mid-range list, creating an engine focused on Ivy and auras that draw cards or ramp so that we can stockpile resources and steadily develop our mana. The overall game plan is pretty resource focused, but we can flex into an aggro plan that's good at threatening the players who are ahead pretty easily thanks to the natural Voltron elements of putting auras on Ivy, and we also have some cards like Strongback that can open up explosive storm-style turns. With so many auras, leaning into the Enchantress theme was obvious, but we don't want to make the mistake of becoming an Enchantress deck that happens to use Ivy. Because the token copies of auras enter the battlefield, she works particularly well with Constellation-style Enchantresses like Eidolon of Blossoms. We have some secondary themes as well. Getting additional value out of targeting makes a lot of sense when our plan is to cast auras almost every turn, and there are some very unique cards in that space. Since Ivy copies spells and loves being copied herself, it was also reasonable to dip into copying and token copying for force multiplication options. Ivy is a commander that people tend to worry about. If they haven't seen her in action, she's just kind of weird, and players tend to assign a higher threat value to weird if they have experience in the format. Once we've copied an aura with her and start drawing cards and flying in for damage, the threat level ratchets up quickly, and players will often spend their removal spells on her even when she isn't coming their way. She's very important to the deck, and it can be a real struggle if we lose access to her or if she ends up too expensive after a few removal spells. The plan B of just pumping evasive creatures with auras can get there, but it's definitely much lower in power level and will struggle to take down games in bracket 3. Her role in the deck is to serve as the core of a value engine to generate overwhelming resources, and then to actually close out the game, either over the course of a few somewhat pumped attacks, or explosively with a combination of massive finisher auras. The first category of cards we'll talk about are the glue that holds the deck together. These are auras that draw cards in one way or another, some of them when they enter the battlefield, some of them when we connect in combat. The former become inexpensive divinations or divinations with upside with Ivy on the field, and the latter can help snowball our card advantage through combat. The fact that they're auras rather than instants and sorceries means they fuel Enchantress draw engines and help contribute to the counts for effects that care about enchantments, and we can also get other value out of the token copies of them Ivy creates. Our finisher auras are generally how we'll win the game, and while they have some of the same synergies as our cantrip auras, they're more expensive and have less utility in general. We have a few effects like Ancestral Mask that scale with our game plan, with Strongback being one of the most powerful cards in the deck. Its hefty cost reduction can make it possible to storm off with different types of auras, and even when that doesn't happen, it can provide massive pump to Ivy and a friend. Nerd Rage, another aura from the Fallout precons, straddles the line between cantrip and finisher, making it one of our best draws in the mid-game. If we can copy it, we'll almost always get the pump trigger, which can represent a 2-hit kill with Ivy while other creatures wall up someone else. We need other creatures in play to target so Ivy can do her thing, so we've drafted a roster of cheap evasive creatures and creatures that get value out of being targeted. Spellwild Oof can let us cheat massively on mana, and Stormchaser Drake and Triton Fortune Hunter let us amplify the draws we get from our cantrip auras. Giggling Skitterspike can serve as a finisher since we can boost its power substantially and then target it multiple times in a turn. A quick note on cost reduction for Magic Online players: if you make use of the yield when no action is available options, the client won't recognize a cost reduced aura as an available action and will automatically yield priority, so when you have a cost reducer in play, it's a good idea to disable your yield so you don't get got. Channel regulars are probably aware that I'm skeptical of force multipliers and use them pretty sparingly, but this deck is an exception. The reason is that most of these cards still do something even if they aren't operating at peak potential. We want to copy Ivy with our Spark Double type cards, but it can also be worthwhile to copy a value creature, and as long as we have a creature, they aren't a dead draw if Ivy isn't available. Twinning Staff is just too good to pass up, and it's worth noting that the copies it creates do count as a spell targeting a permanent for the likes of Stormchaser Drake and Giggling Skitterspike. The Suvin Duplimancy can do some truly bizarre things, but even if it just generates a little value, it will usually pull its weight. The fact that Ivy is a rogue makes Notorious Throng an incredible extra turn spell for us. Second Harvest deserves its own special mention. In a game where we get to do our thing, this card can basically set up combo wins all by itself. It's especially crazy if we have some token versions of Ivy kicking around, but just copying a bunch of token auras to draw cards and pump our board can be massive. These token auras don't count as targeting for our creatures that care about that, but they do get around things like hexproof since they aren't being cast, which can come into play occasionally. I put Swiftfoot Boots in this category because access to haste for Ivy is extremely important in grindier games. The protection element is nice, but it's really the ability to set up attacks with her immediately that we're after. We're mid-range overall, so we have to have some draw engines. We have 4 creatures that draw whenever one of our auras enter, which also counts the token copies that Ivy creates. We also have the very unique Knick-Knack Oof, which can be a late-game burst of card draw and finisher potential when we have enough mana. Eternal Witness is very versatile, and creating copies of it with Vesuvan Duplimancy or even one of our clone effects can be extremely worthwhile, either grabbing what we need to restart the engine, letting us second harvest again, or just picking up a piece of interaction for a second use. The other pillar of our mid-range core is Ramp. Birds of Paradise is too good to pass up since it both ramps and fixes, while being a creature we can put auras on, and since it flies, it can actually start getting into the red zone with some pump. Game Changer Crop Rotation and Legacy Staple Sowing Mycospawn have incredible utility thanks to the lands we've included, which we'll cover in more depth later on. Herald of the Pantheon is another cost reducer that can set up some nice Ivy curves, allowing us to cast her and a 2-drop aura on turn 3. Jaheira is a powerhouse in this deck since it doesn't matter what type the tokens are. Tapping copied auras for mana is bizarre and can represent explosive potential. Migratory Greathorn is one of our 2 mutate cards, so it's time to talk about that. Perhaps the weirdest thing Ivy can do involves mutate. If she copies a mutate targeting another creature, the copy that targets her is a token, and if we put it on top of Ivy, she becomes a non-legendary token version of herself, which opens up some very strange shenanigans. One with Nature can be a great way to ramp a few times in the early game, and Scale the Heights gets doubled by Ivy, which can be a nice way to get a few lands out of our hand when we've drawn several cards. We play a healthy amount of interaction, most of which is really meant to help protect our plan more than anything else. We run a trio of counterspells, including Game Changer Fierce Guardianship, which comes online early with Ivy and gives us the freedom to tap out to get the engine going. Beast Within is an excellent catch-all, and Eel Umbra, Slip Out the Back, and Tamiyo's Safekeeping can all help protect Ivy from opposing interaction. Gem Razor is our second mutate option, and getting to blow up 2 artifacts or enchantments for just 3 mana is a great rate. Finally, we have Vows of Flight and Wildness, which help bolster our aura count, but can also help us in racing situations since they turn attackers elsewhere, but Ivy does count for effects that target opponents' creatures too, so they give her some free pump in the process. We play 40 total lands, which is basically my minimum for deck building at this point, and the overall mana base itself doesn't have much to discuss besides the inclusion of our final game changer, Gaia's Cradle. We're usually only going to be tapping it for somewhere between 2 and 5 mana, but that additional mana goes a long way towards being able to chain auras or get an early finisher aura into play. If you don't have the budget or like to proxy or play on Magic Online, this can be replaced with Chrome Mox, or you can just sub in another green producing land and run 2 game changers, or tinker with the deck to fit in a third. We have 12 utility lands, including some nice interaction and value pieces, but a few in particular are worth talking about since we do run Crop Rotation, Mycospawn, and Urza's Cave to tutor them up. Getting Gaia's Cradle will usually be the first choice, but Hall of the Bandit Lord is a rare, efficient way to grant Ivy haste, and Alchemist's Refuge can help us play her at flash speed to have a similar effect. One of the things I found in games with this deck was that some access to haste for Ivy was incredibly important, since otherwise she would just sit around to be removed over and over. Being able to grab Mystic Sanctuary is also nice, and this will usually end up letting us redraw a counterspell we've used, but the dream is to set up a second harvest. Now that we've seen the list, we can envision our overall game plan. Our early turns will ideally involve casting some combination of Ivy, another creature, and an aura by turn 3 to start getting some value going, and we really want to prioritize hitting our land drops as we attend to our resource generation. We also want to start thinking about who we want to get commander damage stacking up on based on the other commanders we see and the likely plans involved. Control players should actually be our first target, since we may go through a stretch of the game where we can't get at them, and getting some early Ivy damage on them can be very important later on. In the mid-game, ideally the engine will be running, and we can look to enhance it either by copying Ivy for more copy shenanigans, or landing one of our Enchantress draw creatures, or maybe even both. In some mid-games, we might have the mana or cost reduction to deploy finisher auras early and turn Ivy into a serious Voltron threat. The late game for this deck is just about getting weird with it, copying anything and everything we can to make Ivy and our other creatures massive threats to take down our opponents. The list has some liabilities, and the foremost one is how reliant it is on Ivy. It actually doesn't have a lot of other weaknesses, but this one is so damaging that it needs to be addressed. Removal targeting Ivy, especially repeated removal linked to other commanders, can make it incredibly difficult to execute our plan. I played a game against Rin and Seri where I was just completely shut down from operating until I could find a protection spell thanks to the threat of activation, and it was miserable. We address this weakness in deck building with counterspells and Way to Protect Her or Give Her Haste, but it honestly isn't enough for 3 players worth of potential interaction, and we can't really afford to run more without watering down our plan. Patience is our best asset when it comes to playing around this weakness. Opting out of the Ivy plan to get a Curiosity on an evasive creature can let us bide our time and build up resources, or the 2-for-1 may be attractive enough to draw out removal spells. We also want to be very careful about playing Ivy into probable board wipes if we don't have a way to keep her around. A lesser weakness that stems from our Enchantress theme is typal sweepers like Farewell. Farewell is a problem for any deck looking to have a board or a graveyard, but it and its brethren Austere Command and Merciless Eviction can be particularly rough for us since they can choose to wipe out our enchantments, which will usually leave us with a very underwhelming board while everyone else gets to keep their monsters. Reserving our counterspells for these kinds of sweepers is really the only way around them, so sometimes letting Ivy die or letting a scary permanent resolve is just required to ensure we don't get blown out. Now that we've got a handle on the list, let's hop into some games. Our first opponent is Tom Bombadil. This 5-color commander cares about sagas, chaining through them once he's in play, which can be quite powerful. Sagas got a massive shot in the arm from the release of the Final Fantasy set, so it'll be interesting to see which ones they've chosen. With an enchantment focus, they're likely to lean into Enchantress effects as well. Next up is Hapatra, Vizier of Poisons. This Golgari Snake Queen isn't one to be trifled with. Hapatra is a self-contained engine, doling out -1/-1 counters in combat and creating a death-touching snake whenever a -1/-1 counter is put on a creature. There are several combos that she can pull off, which is always something to watch out for, and the combination of counter and token synergies opens up a lot of room for options. The Wise Mothman is our third opponent, and like Hapatra, it has several possible synergies to work with due to its ability to fill graveyards and dole out counters. On top of that, the Mothman itself is a robust Voltron threat, and Sultai colors mean it's very good at protecting its plan or stopping others. This commander tends to have a pretty high threat profile, so we should probably keep that in mind in case it's relevant politically. Bombadil won the die roll, so we're going last. Our opening hand is solid, including a little of everything we might want besides a cantripping aura, and Birds of Paradise should really do some work with a hand that's more geared toward the middle of the game. Everyone but Tom Bombadil keeps 7 cards, while Tom mulligans to 6. Tom plays and cracks a Windswept Heath, fetching up a shadowy backstreet and surveilling an Urborg into their graveyard. Hapatra and Mothman just play basics, and we draw a Shielding Plaques. There's that cantrip aura we were looking for. We play Command Tower and our Burb and then pass. Bombadil pays 2 life to have a Temple Garden enter untapped, then Farseek's up at Thundering Falls, surveilling what they find to the top of their library this time. Hapatra has a second Forest and then a Channeler Initiate, which is a cool -1/-1 counter mana dork. It seems like they're having some color woes, which that should help. Mothman plays a Necroblossom Snarl, revealing an Overgrown Tomb, then casts Basking Broodscale. This can be a combo piece, so people will definitely be looking their way. We draw a Tangled Islet, which will let us hang on to our Mystic Sanctuary for some possible future value and play it and cast Ivy. Bombadil plays and cracks a Misty Rainforest for an Overgrown Tomb of their own, losing 2 life so it can help cast a Bloom Tender. They follow up with Garnet, Princess of Alexandria, which can get repeated value out of sagas. Hapatra has a Swamp, then their commander. Mothman plays Tainted Isle and putrefies Hapatra immediately. They've probably been hurt by her in the past. Ivy triggers and we very carefully decline. We draw Vow of Wildness, which makes us a little less worried about Mothman. We play our Mystic Sanctuary, then attack Ivy into Bombadil since they're ramping. After that, we pass, and our plan is to hold up Shielding Plaques. Bombadil really wants to get their ramp on, tapping their Bloom Tender to help cast its big cousin Fabro Elder, then casting the Weatherseed Treaty. The Saga picks up its first counter, and they search up an island, and then they head to combat, attacking us with Garnet. She triggers, and they remove the lore counter from the treaty, pumping her to deal 3 lifelinking damage. On their end step, we figured this is a good time to deploy the Plaques, only to realize it doesn't have Flash. The design of the card really feels like it should have Flash, so I was definitely hoodwinked. Oops. Hapatra comes back down for 4 mana, and then they play a Forest and tap out and pass. Mothman plays that Overgrown Tomb, taking 2 so they can cast a very threatening Ouroboros. They head to combat, and the Space Snake triggers, adding a counter to itself in the Brood Scale, which triggers, netting them an Eldrazi spawn before they pass. We draw an Offer You Can't Refuse, which is always some nice insurance. We have some options now, but playing out Tanglespan Lookout sets us up to be blown out and is a somewhat threatening play at a table where all 3 of our opponents are doing something scary. Instead, we play our Reliquary Tower and cast the Shielding Plaques targeting Birds of Paradise, which triggers Ivy. This will draw us just a couple cards and will mean that Hapatra can't start eating away at our board. We find a Jaheira and an Irenicus' Vile Duplication, and this is definitely seeming like a game where we'll want to take it slow. We have everything we need to start doing very powerful stuff, but we need some more time time and mana to get it going safely. For that reason, we pass without attacking. It seems like at least 2 of the players have a grudge going, and we don't want to draw their ire or get into one with Bombadil. Bombadil's Saga ticks up, getting them a tap plains, and they play Sigil of the Empty Throne, a powerful enchantment synergy piece. We'd rather use our counterspell to protect our own plan or stop an actual win with 2 combo pieces on the board, so we let it through, and we also don't counter the Awaken the Honored Dead that follows, since we're pretty sure we know where it's going. Sigil triggers, getting them their first angel, and then Awaken blows up the Ourobororoid exactly as we foretold. This does represent a pretty nasty removal engine for us to worry about, but now they've ticked off Mothman, which works for our slow playing political plan. They attack Hapatra with Garnet this time, which is an indicator that we've dropped down on the threat index. They use her trigger to reset both their sagas, turning the princess into a chunky 5/5 before she connects. Hapatra swings at us first thing, and we're happy to let her through since her counter is likely destined for Bloom Tender. She connects and takes out the mana Doric as expected, creating a Death Touch Snake when the counter hits. In second main, she casts Wickerbough Elder, a card that could be a bit of a problem for us, but it's currently a problem for Bombadil since they immediately use their Channeler to activate it, removing its -1/-1 counter to blow up Sigil of the Empty Throne. They follow up with the Bajuka Bog, targeting Tom, taking care of it for good. Mothman plays a swamp and drops their commander, irradiating the table when it enters. We draw a forest, then our rad counter mills a Slitherblade, meaning we lose a life and Mothman gets a trigger. They put the counter on their brood scale for another Eldrazi spawn, and we play our forest and cast Jaheira. We're pretty committed to this fly under the radar plan at this point, especially with all of our opponents messing with one another, so rather than do something like get a card draw engine online or copy Ivy, we just cast our vow on Mothman to ensure its aggression goes elsewhere. We trigger Ivy and get a copy, but we pass through combat, maintaining our neutrality and keeping up a decent blocker. With mana from our token auras and Jaheira next turn, we should be able to start doing some work, and our counterspell means we'll probably get to that point. Tom has several triggers heading into their main phase. They grab a tap forest with their treaty, mill an Eerie Ultimatum due to radiation, triggering Mothman, who adds another counter to the brood scale, creating yet another spawn, and then get retribution on Wickerbough Elder with Awaken the Honored Dead, which we're very happy to see. They play Marsh Flats, bringing them down to 1 card in hand and pass the turn. Hapatra mills a forest, hanging on to their rad counter. They cast Splendid Agony, putting -1/-1 counters on their Channeler Initiate and the Mothman, and creating 2 snakes with Hapatra. They follow up with Courage and Crisis, targeting Hapatra, and we get to learn another lesson about shielding plaques, or about Ivy and Hexproof at least. We try to use her trigger to copy the spell, but the copy is still owned by our opponent, so it can't take effect at all. Hapatra gets a +1/+1 counter, and they get to proliferate, choosing Hapatra, their Channeler, Mothman, and both of the sagas, speeding them along so Tom Bombadil can't get any triggers off them down the line. The treaty creates a 1/1 Sapperling, Awaken the Honored Dead mills 3, and there's a non-land in the mix to trigger Mothman for another brood scale counter and spawn, before Mothman gets smaller and Hapatra gets bigger, and finally she makes 2 more snake tokens. Mothman's radiation mills a forest and Singularity Rupture, and the Mothman adds another counter to the brood scale and nets another spawn. They tap out to cast Herd Baloth, then play in Crack Verdant Catacombs, searching up a sunken ruins. They attack Hapatra with their commanders, spreading rad counters across the table, and then pass the turn. We draw a very spicy Ancestral Mask and mill a forest, remaining radioactive. It's time to make some moves, and we start by using our token auras to make some mana thanks to Jaheira to help cast Irenicus's Vile Duplication targeting our Birds of Paradise, which triggers Ivy, so we get to make a token copy of both. We then cast Ancestral Mask on our original bird since it's protected by shielding plaques, and both our Ivies trigger to get copies of the powerful aura. This conveniently makes the OG Ivy exactly 21 power, and since Tom has an angel blocker, we have to choose between eliminating Hapatra or Mothman. Hapatra has 4 cards in hand to Mothman's 3, and they're likely packing more removal than the other decks, so we send Ivy their way to knock them out. Bombadil cracks their Marsh Flats on our end step, fetching up a Raucous Theater and surveilling a Dryad of the Elysian Grove into their graveyard. They mill summon Yojimbo to their rad counter, which prompts Mothman to add another counter to the brood scale and create another Eldrazi spawn. They add their 3rd lore counter to both sagas, discarding a Sanctum Weaver to Awaken the Honored Dead to rebuy Yojimbo, then giving Garnet a total of +5/+5 in trample with the treaty since they have Domain fully online. They attack their big lifelinker into Mothman, but unfortunately she doesn't have any sagas to take down. Mothman chump blocks with 2 spawns, which is a little puzzling, and they fall to 28 while Bombadil gains up to 47. In their second main, they cast What Must Be Done, choosing to destroy all creatures and artifacts, and we consider letting it happen since we'd still be very far ahead, and Mothman does have a very overrunnable board. But ultimately we decide we'd rather make them an offer they can't refuse. We're almost certain to win if we untap with this board, so it's worth the risk. They cast Summon Yojimbo and use its first chapter to exile the Ancestral Mask token on our commander. We might have screwed up our shielding plaques, but it's doing some work. They pass after that, out of cards entirely. Mothman mills an Innkeeper's Talent and a Screeching Scorch Beast, using their commander's trigger to add counters to both their Broodscale and their Baloth and create the corresponding tokens. They cast a Tato Farmer, which makes it seem unlikely they'll be wiping the board, and then follow up with a Golgari Signet. They play Dimir Aqueduct, bouncing one of their swamps, and giving themselves 2 rad counters with the Tato Farmer. Using some Scion mana, they cast Watchful Radstag, leaving them with 1 card in hand and us pretty sure the coast is clear. We draw Beast Within, which is a great addition to our hand, and mill a Nerd Rage, which would have definitely sealed things up for us. Mothman puts another counter on their Baloth, adding another beast to their menagerie, which evolves their Radstag, causing it to copy itself. We use our Aura and Jaheira mana engine to cast Tanglespan Lookout, then follow up with Octopus Umbra and our shielded Birds of Paradise. Both IVs get a copy of the massive Totem Armor enchantment, and we draw Gaia's Cradle, Boseiju Who Endures, and Island from the Lookout triggers. This leaves our backup IV at a convenient 26 power, and we head to combat, swinging it at the Mothman and our birds and our actual IV at Tom Bombadil. We tap down the Angel token, the Wise Mothman, and the Herd Baloth with our Octopi Umbra triggers, then crash in, knocking Mothman out of the game and taking Bombadil down to 10 and up to 13 IV damage. We play our Cradle and pass, and after taking a draw step, Bombadil concedes, meaning we win the game. Good game as always to our opponents. Tom Bombadil got off to a pretty strong mid-game, but they weren't able to create a lasting engine. It may have been worth it for them to sacrifice Garnet to take down both their sagas, but I'm not sure it's reasonable for them to play around proliferation or removal there. They were punished either way, but it's pretty easy to imagine how powerful a deck like this can be if it manages to start chaining sagas with its very resilient commander. Hapatra didn't get to play their commander on turn 2, which is always a liability for that deck, and Mothman slowed them down even further with a removal spell. They didn't get to land any payoffs, and fortunately for us, spent their resources messing with the other 2 players. This commander is always extremely threatening, particularly because it comes online so early, but that wasn't the case in this game. The Wise Mothman did an awful lot, but they never managed to turn that into much advantage, despite facing minimal interaction. If Ouroboros had lived, they probably would have ended up archenemy, and based on what we saw afterward, they probably would have been completely crippled when the table rallied against them. I'm still impressed by how many themes this commander can make use of, but I can't help but wonder if that might be a liability for deck building for some players, leading to a plan that's a little too diffuse. I wanted to showcase this game primarily for the way it unfolded politically. Ivy generally wants to go pretty fast, but our misplay with shielding plaques was kind of a hidden boon that allowed us to recognize what the dynamic was at the table and keep our threat profile low, while our opponents spent their resources on each other instead of us. We did get to see how explosive the deck can be. Jaheira is an incredible mana engine, especially with multiple IVs, and the ability to double and triple up on powerful auras like Ancestral Mask and Octopus Umbra does an incredible job of closing out games. Our first opponent is Sheoldred the Apocalypse. Given how many cards we're likely to draw, Sheoldred could be a real problem for us, and mono black decks often make it difficult to keep creatures on the board. We can expect a little combo potential from them with the limited draw 7 effects available to their mono color, and Sheoldred is likely to draw some hate as she continually punishes the rest of the table. Jensen Karthalion is our next opponent, and I'm curious to see what they're up to. Technically a 5-color commander, Jensen can represent a multicolor Matters theme, but the payoff is pretty paltry unless they're casting Wooburg spells. Having access to a 2-color commander that opens up all 5 colors is pretty powerful on its own though, even if it's just a good stuff strategy. Our third opponent is Greta Sweettooth Scourge, an uncommon Golgari commander that uses food tokens for value. In addition to green-black grinding, we can expect token shenanigans and likely some combo potential. We win the die roll and are going first, and our hand is okay. Herald of the Pantheon into Ivy and Curiosity is a little fragile, but it's a solid plan, and Tamiyo's safekeeping can potentially protect it. We draw Vesuvan Duplimancy, which could be fun, and everyone just plays lands for their first turns, including a Bajuka Bog on an empty graveyard. We draw Eternal Witness, which could make Duplimancy very fun, and then run out our Yavimaya Coast and cast our Herald. Sheoldred has a Swamp and a Lightning Greaves, and Jensen plays an Exotic Orchard into Sylvan Library, which is a rough card into Sheoldred. Greta just plays a Bayou, and we draw and play Tropical Island, casting Ivy, then casting Curiosity on our Herald, the life gain from which offsets our Pain land. Ivy triggers and gets a copy, and we attack our Herald into Sheoldred since they're obviously a problem for our plan to draw all the cards. We connect, adding a Glasspool Mimic to our hand, and then pass. As long as we can untap to keep up Tamiyo's safekeeping, we should be in great shape. Sheoldred has a third Swamp and casts Nighthawk Scavenger, turtling up by protecting it with Lightning Greaves. On their draw step, Jensen triggers Sylvan Library but opts to put 2 cards back. They cast Exploration, then play Baldur's Gate, which suggests they're up to some kind of land shenanigans, which is fun. They pay 2 life to Godless Shrine so they can cast Tireless Provisioner before passing. Greta plays a Swamp, then casts their commander, creating a food token. We draw Flitterstep Eidolon, which is an expensive way to start getting past Nighthawk later on. We play Alchemist Refuge, then cast our Duplimancy with Herald's Discount and gain a life from his trigger. We don't have any great attacks for Herald, but we send Ivy Jensen's way since they could theoretically draw cards with Library someday. Ivy connects, and we draw a Slitherblade, then pass, keeping up our protection spell. The mono black player has another Swamp and cast their commander. They equip Shieldred with their Greaves and head to combat, attacking into Greta for 4 commander damage. Jensen wisely doesn't draw extra cards with Shieldred, but she still punishes them for the one they draw. They play a Gateway Plaza, paying for it and choosing the seldom used food mode for Tireless Provisioner's trigger, which is one way to fight against Shieldred. Actually, I'll stop announcing Shieldred triggers unless they're kind of interesting. Greta loses 2, then casts their own Tireless Provisioner, playing a forest and creating a treasure. They activate Greta to sacrifice their food, drawing a card and losing a total of 3 life. We draw Vow of Wildness, which would be nice to put on Shieldred if we can find a way to deal with her boots. We send Ivy at Greta this time, spreading the love so to speak, and pick up a second Vow of the Flight variety. We have a lot of options, but nothing is incredibly exciting and the board feels very wipeable, so we don't want to overextend. We have a handle on drawing cards, so we opt to improve our mana situation, playing Verdant Catacombs and then casting Glasspool Mimic as a copy of Herald of the Pantheon, which can also help offset the life lost from Shieldred. Shieldred gains 2, then heads to combat attacking us. We just take it and they pass the turn. Jensen opts not to use the library again, and we're expecting some fireworks when they crop rotate their breeding pool away, but they've just gotten themselves a Heap Gate, which Tireless Provisioner rewards them with a treasure for, and then it doles out a food when they play Mana Confluence. They've got a lot of mana, but are down to 1 card in hand without much of a board. Greta falls to 27 on their draw step, then casts a Tireless Tracker, playing a forest to get themselves a clue and a treasure. They use a treasure and tap out to cast Warren Soul Trader, and suddenly they're very scary, since that's definitely up to unfair things in their deck. On their end step, we crack our Verdant Catacombs, finding a Hedge Maze, and we surveil a very welcome counterspell to the top of our deck. We draw it, falling to 30, then bestow Flitterstep Eidolon onto our original Herald for just 4 mana, triggering both Heralds for 2 life, Duplimancy for a 3rd Herald, and then copying the Eidolon for Ivy. We opt to split our attacks between Shieldred and Greta, stacking up commander damage on Greta since we're a little more worried about the combo possibility. We find a Setessan Champion and an offer you can't refuse, losing 4 life. We were really hoping to find a land, but a counterspell we can cast with our 1 mana is a decent backup. We head to our cleanup step, and since we're already drawing a fair amount and losing a lot of life, we ditch our Setessan Champion. Shieldred gains 2, then plays a Deserted Temple and casts Haunt of Hightower. They give the Haunt the boots and head to combat, attacking us with both creatures. We discard our Slitherblade to the Haunt's attack trigger, growing it, and then put our cloned Herald in front of Shieldred to buffer our life total a bit. The Haunt grows again when it dies, and then they pass. Jensen cracks 2 foods on their end step, going up to 41. They spend that life total immediately on a Sylvan Library activation, but don't draw any extra cards. They cast a Sylvan Scrying, growing the Haunt and searching up a Simic Guildgate, which they play, triggering their Provisioner for more food. Greta untaps and pumps 5 mana into a Pest Infestation, targeting our Vesuvan Duplimancy and Shieldred's Lightning Greaves. We like Duplimancy, obviously, but we want those Greaves gone, so we let it resolve and they make 4 pests, which is a little scary given their Soul Trader, and the Haunt gets 2 more counters. We draw a Forest and cast a 1 mana Vow of Wildness on the Haunt, triggering our Heralds for 2 life and copying the Vow for Ivy. We repeat the process with Vow of Flight, enchanting Shieldred, and suddenly that particular problem is solved. Our life total is getting low, so we just swing Ivy into Greta and connect for 8 commander damage and draw Swiftfoot Boots. We play our Forest and pass, wishing in retrospect that we'd played it earlier so we could keep up both counterspell and safekeeping, but we were hoping to draw a more interesting land. Shieldred plays Vesuva to copy their Deserted Temple and heads to combat, attacking Greta with Shieldred and Jensen with the Haunt. The Haunt triggers and Jensen discards Silence, which is a strange card for a Gates deck in bracket 3 to be packing. Both creatures connect, leaving Jensen at 23 and Greta at only 8, and Shieldred passes with quite a bit of mana up. Jensen cracks a food, then untaps. They're desperate enough to use their library again, losing 6 total life to Shieldred to take the best card of their top 3, but then they just pass the turn. Greta falls to a Perilous 6, then cashes in a Pest to Soul Trader for a life-neutral treasure, before cracking a life-negative clue, growing their tracker. They play a Fabled Passage, replacing their clue and getting another treasure, then growing the Haunt and getting even more tokens when they sacrifice the passage for a swamp. They drop down to 2 to crack another clue, adding a second counter to their tracker, and then all but tap out to cast the Great Henge. They sacrifice their remaining pests to Warren Soul Trader, then tap out for real, gaining 2 life from the Henge to cast Malevolent Witch Kite. It triggers the Henge on entry, bringing them back down to 2, and wisely, they don't end up using its ETB trigger. We draw a Knickknack Oof, which isn't really the vibe at the moment. First, we attack Shieldred with our unblockable Ivy, and Greta with our unblockable Herald. Shieldred fights back with the Hero's Downfall, but we use Tamio's Safekeeping on the Herald, making both creatures hexproof and indestructible and gaining 4 life. The Haunt grows when it resolves, and grows 2 more times as Greta sacrifices their remaining pests to the Soul Trader. We connect, knocking Greta out, and starting to get some commander damage on Shieldred, drawing Slip Out the Back and a Bark Channel Pathway. We play the pathway in blue mode and pass, keeping up our Alchemist Refuge and a few other options. Shieldred taps out for Necroma's Memorial, and that's fine by us since their creatures have both taken vows. As they head to combat, Jensen overloads a Cyclonic Rift, but we'd rather keep our board intact whether Shieldred attacks them or not, so we fire off our counterspell and Haunt gets 2 more counters. They head to combat, shedding Shieldred and the Haunt at Jensen and their Nighthawk at us, and that's enough to knock Jensen out and bring us to 16 life. We activate the Refuge at end step, casting our Swiftfoot Boots. We draw Reliquary Tower, but we'd like better land options, so we swing both of our Aura'd Up creatures at Shieldred, putting them 1 Ivy hit away from Doom, and finding an Octopus Umbra and a Gul'Dul Lurker. We're down to 10 life, but we're feeling pretty good as we play our Reliquary Tower and cast Eternal Witness to put Counterspell back in our hand. They're going to need something great to get out of this. What they have is Mikaeus the Unhallowed, which we counter, making the Haunt an 18/18. They knock us down to 5 with their Scavenger before passing, then concede on our draw step, meaning that we win the game. Good game again to our opponents. The Shieldred deck was interesting and had an enormous impact on the game despite casting very few spells overall. The amount of damage she dishes out is just unreal, and makes me think she could be incredible in an aggro list that really capitalizes on the plunging life totals at the table. It didn't seem especially coherent to me, adopting more of a battle cruisery good stuff approach, but the results were still impressive from the command zone alone. Jensen being a Gates deck was fairly surprising, and kudos to that player for being so dedicated to the plan. Land tutors are usually pretty scary in bracket 3 and up, but they were clearly playing towards a Maze's End victory, which resulted in a pretty low power level from what we saw. I think the Wandering Minstrel would probably be a better commander for a 5-color Gates deck, and I was confused about the inclusion of Silence. It seemed like they flooded as well, which can be a real risk with the land-focused deck that doesn't find a solid source of card advantage. Greta had a rough go of it. They were punished more than anyone by Shieldred, and while I'm not sure what they had left in hand, it seemed like they might have been better off banking some food to buffer their life total while we slugged it out with Shieldred. Playing an extremely threatening card like Warren Soul Trader when you're essentially behind can be deadly if you don't have a way to capitalize on it, and they definitely suffered. We would have likely left them alone and focused on Shieldred otherwise, but with the combo piece shown, we had to allocate some pressure to them. Playing this deck into Shieldred was definitely a challenge. I didn't voice it too much in the narration, but I was doing a lot of thinking about how much life I could afford to lose, at least until we were able to neutralize their board with Vows. This was a great showing for those cards in particular, because without them, we would have been forced into some very awkward chump blocking to try to keep our life total high enough to find some answers. It was also a good example of what the middle of the road for this deck looks like, chipping in for minor advantages, but never really getting to go off. Even with the restraint we were showing, attacking with curiosity effects for a few extra cards each turn gets people's attention, so it can be a bit of a tightrope walk. I wasn't crazy about Ivy when I first started building her, but she's grown on me. I don't tend to enjoy fragile plans, and decks that focus and invest in their commander like this one feel very easy to shut down, but there was a lot of dopamine to be found in the play patterns. Copying massive auras felt incredibly unique, and the interactions between cost reducers, copying, and card advantage made for some absolutely insane turns. I mentioned it in the deck tech, but Strongback really can let the deck effectively storm off, and Aura Storm isn't something you see often. She's also interesting because she gets a crazy boost when played against other Aura decks. I didn't showcase it because it was a stomp, but we went up against a Ural the Miststalker player and got to steal all their goodies all game long. It's important for a deck like this to brush up on the strange interactions, both for your sake and your opponent's. Being able to coherently explain what happens when you mutate a copy onto Ivy, why copied spells don't get doubled by token doublers, or why auras that enter the battlefield directly don't target can really smooth things out at the table, and if you go into a game knowing your deck is weird, the onus is on you to ensure that the game proceeds correctly. There are several themes you can explore with Ivy, and I did a fair amount of tinkering before I arrived at this list. The only card I felt didn't really pull its weight was Knick-Knack Oof, but the ceiling on it is just so crazy that I'd probably leave it in for now. I think the mutate interaction with Ivy is definitely the kookiest thing you can get up to with her, and you could definitely lean into that more if you were interested while keeping the shell mostly intact. I'd swap out Crop Rotation and Gaia's Cradle for Worldly and Mystical Tutor to make it a little easier to set up mutates into a token generator, and I'd cut Hall of the Bandit Lord and Knick-Knack Oof and your choice of Cantrip Aura to make root for the Common Good, Full Flowering, and Rootcast Apprenticeship to have more access to that effect. You could also go for more of a Spellslinger Ivy version, which opts to play instants and sorceries instead of auras. I'm not going to do a card-by-card change for that since it would be very extensive, but you'd want to shift out the Enchantress stuff for Spellslinger support like Archmage Emeritus, and trade out the auras for pump spells and cantrips, then modify the Aura Carriers category to focus on ramp and value with Mana Dorks and the likes of Coiling Oracle. This version tends to look a little more combo-y, so I think I'd look to include Venerated Rot Priest since that gets much better when you can chain spells, and the instants tend to be much more efficient than the auras. Thanks for watching, and be sure to like, share, and subscribe to help the channel grow. Unfortunately, I ran into an editing issue with the video on archetypes I have coming that caused some delays, but it should be out this week. Definitely drop a comment as well. I'd love to hear from you about the deck, the games, ideas for the channel, or even just to talk about the Commander format in general. Good luck and have fun in your future endeavors. Magic Boy out.